television. Thank you for watching. It's time for talk. Each evening at this time, Monday through Friday, Rosemary interviews local personalities and others who bring items of interest to this community. Time for Talk is designed to cooperate with our local community betterment program. And now, it's time for talk.
Let me tell you about this picture. This is Metz Cherry, Coach Metz Cherry, when he was at Southwest Missouri State College in the fall of 1928. He came from there to Kennett and coached from 1929 through 1949, and we have a small diary that he fixed, and you can see it's really well worn. I want to read you just a section of an entry from Sunday, January 24th, 1932. Never run back. 1 yard toward the goal is worth more than 50 yards toward the sidelines and requires less effort. We're going to talk about this. Let me show you also just a little bit more in here. You see here is a 1941 record of the schools. Here's the Hornersville, Zenith, Caruth, Cardwell. And then also, as a typical grandfather, let me show you a few sheets where some of the grandchildren got hold of his pages and just scribbled everything on here. But let me show you the man. Let me introduce you to the man who really fixed this up and who has compiled a very unusual record. Coach Cherry, good to welcome you to our studio, and I want to hear some exciting things today from this wealth of knowledge you have here. Let me also introduce two other guests who are here. We have Tom Crunk of the class of 1939, and next to Tom is T-Bone Hall, who was the class of 1948. And T-Bone, did you say you were on the last football team that Coach Cherry coached?
The football team of 1947 during the fall. That was his last football team. Yes.
All right. And were both of you on winning seasons?
Yes, ma'am. Well, sure
for Coach Cherry.
Yes.
Okay. You've compiled an unusual record. I want to know about this. What prompted this?
Well, it's a record book for one thing. I started keeping it maybe a couple of years after I started coaching, and after that, it's more or less accurate. I had to go back in my memory and record some of those things, but the first part of that book has got a story to it. The first year that I coached, we'd had a real good coach the year before, and I inherited some pretty fair football players, and we won half of our games. But a lot of them were only sophomores, and the next 2 years they didn't lose a game and hardly got scored on.
Boy, what a record.
So I decided that because of that I ought to write a book for all young coaches beginning what a young football coach ought to know. And I got started pretty good, and those boys graduated. And then the next year I realized that it wasn't the coach that makes the team, it's the boys. And I quit writing the book.
Very good.
It's an unfinished novel.
Okay, you really learned from your first few years.
Yes,
A coach always learns more than his players, than his students as he goes along. All right, this man has been held in great esteem by his players through the years and by most of Kennett. And I do know that there's going to be a special day that they're going to honor you. It's called an era reunion. An era because of that 20-year span in there. And that special day will be March 7th, and we may talk a little bit about that a little later. Coach Cherry, review some of the early equipment for us. Tell us about the differences. Tell us about some of did you have uniforms, and was this a usual thing? What did you have classy looking uniforms to run down the field with here in Kennett?
I'll tell you what we had in the old days.
In the olden days, okay, here we go.
The boys got out and worked, or they borrowed from their dad and bought all of their equipment except the school furnished the pants that you used in practice and games, the boys bought, and shoulder pads. We furnished shoulder pads. But the boys were responsible for helmets, shoes, everything. 5 football shoes. And they would take an old pair of high-topped work shoes to Fred Ford, and Fred would knock the heels off and nail on leather cleats, and that's what they wore.
And it was all right. That was,
Yes,
I mean, it didn't matter what anybody wore.
And we were talking this morning about our lack of sanitation. Now, those pants, in those days, we didn't have automatic washing machines. We didn't have equipment men or anything like schools do today to take care of the equipment. So the boys, they furnished the jersey that they wore to practice in, but the school would furnish the game jersey. And their instructions were, I expect these fellows remember, take that old sweat-soaked jersey home Friday night and have your mother wash it, and we gave them instructions about how to do it, and let it dry out, and then bring it back for the next game. They did their own laundry at home.
Did you tell me that the pads were sewn in?
The pads were sewn in, and that was one reason, even if we'd had machines, I don't think it would have worked. So once a year, we would send them off to an equipment place, and they would dry clean them at the end of the year and patch up anything.
Once a year?
Yes,
whether they needed it or not?
After the season was over, they quit. And I've been wondering how we did if it was a real muddy game. I think what we did was to let them dry out and then
just beat them.
brush them.
Yeah.
Beat them up.
Oh, well, I imagine you couldn't even tell what the school colors were at that point by the end of the season.
Well,
of course, if the pants were black, you were in luck.
no, we always knew it was black and gold, and that brings up an interesting story. After I became principal.
Okay, now after you coached, or while you were coaching, were you also principal?
Well, 2 years I was coaching and high school principal both, and then 3 years we had other coaches. And one of those coaches came to me, Mr. Sapp, who passed away recently, and said, now, I have always liked a color, light blue and gold. And he said, you know, a lot of teams are not using the school colors in the jerseys anyhow. And our colors here had been black and gold from the beginning, and our people recognized that. Well, I thought about it, and I agreed with him that they're not using that color in their game jerseys, maybe. And so we ordered 33, I think it was, jerseys, pants, light blue and gold. Well, somebody made a mistake, and when they came, they were royal blue and gold, which disappointed him as well as me. Well, you've heard of outcries. There was an outcry on Thanksgiving Day when they trotted out on the field.
In royal blue
and they'd say, well, of course I couldn't hear them say it, but I knew what they were saying. Who gave them the right to change the school colors? So during the game, Kennett made a pretty bad mistake and lost the game to Crothersville, which made that color even worse in their mind.
Oh.
So I spent the next week on the telephone talking to superintendents and principals and coaches. I don't remember how I found out who had blue and gold as their colors, but I had some way of doing that. And I sold those jerseys, and we used the pants to practice in from then on.
Okay, so you redeemed the whole transaction.
Went back to black and gold.
You went back and been black and gold ever since.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, Tom, you were one of his students. 1939, you graduated. Did you have a winning year? Tell me about the year, and were you football or track, or don't tell me you could run.
Well, you couldn't help but looking now, but Rosemary,
Why did you wear your old football uniform then?
I don't know how I'd get it on. I weighed 168 in high school. Everybody thought I was big. We just didn't have big people then. I weighed 168 pounds, and people thought I was big. No, I was fortunate enough to letter all 4 years in football and track both.
What'd you do in track?
In track, I ran the quarter mile, the high hurdles, low hurdles, put the shot through the discus.
Oh, okay.
I know Coach Cherry was always worried about me doing as many events as I did. He'll tell himself he worried that in later life it would bother me, but he knew that I stayed in good shape the year round, not only in football season or track season, but I stayed in good shape. I went to bed early and I trained hard, and
now, you don't have to do a PR job for yourself. You're not. What do you remember about Tom? Anything in particular?
I sure do, and I'm not saying this to make him feel good, because he's not going to run for office this year.
Good thought.
But I'll tell you a little story about him. He could be in, an athlete in those days could be in 4 running events. Well, he would win the high hurdles, and then he was going to run the low hurdles. But just before he would run the low hurdles, he had to run a 1/4 of a mile, which is all the way around that track. Well, he would run the 440 just fast enough to win it, because he knew he had to just get right in there and run the low hurdles right afterwards. And then he would rest up a while, and we had a relay where one boy ran a 220 and 2 boys ran 110, and then the last boy ran a 1/4. Well, he would run that 1/4 again, you see. So I have often wondered what some other boys would have done. Now, had I been the runner, I think I would have gone to the coach sometime during the year and said, why don't you let me stay out of the low hurdles so that maybe I can set a record in that 440. I believe I could set a record if you didn't have me running the hurdles. But he never did do that, because he wanted those points for the team. He didn't want to make a big name for Tom Crunk.
Good.
And I thought people ought to know that.
All right, that's good.
well,
All right.
let me tell you about Coach Cherry. He was a lot more than a coach. I know I personally have ran a lot of races. I know one race that he yelled for me to come back on a medley relay at Cape Girardeau. We were so far behind. But he told me we had, and I'd had a hard day. I'd set a record, I tied the high hurdle record. I broke my own low hurdle record. I set a record in the discus and second in the shot, and I'd had a hard day. And on the medley relay, when baton came around, the guys were already around the curve. The guys sitting around said he yelled for me to come back, but I went on and ran it and won it. But I did it for him, because he said we had to have
Coach really meant something.
Well, that's right, that's right. And, you know, I named my daughter after him.
T-Bone, what about your experiences with Coach Cherry?
Well, he had a winning record in track and football, but I think the main thing that all of his players remember is what kind of man he was, and he taught this, to live the good life, the clean life. And he didn't allow cursing, and that was one of the things that would really upset him.
What would he do?
He'd make you run laps after practice.
Oh, okay.
And then he never, when he'd scold you, he'd just look at you and look down, shake his head, and walk off, and you knew that you did the wrong thing. He never did put his hand on you. He never did bawl you out or anything. Just nod his head, shake, and that was enough. But he was a fine man. He was like a father to very many football players and track men.
And that's why you all are interested in sort of this Metz Cherry Day.
That's right.
And what about that as we go off?
All right. That's April the 7th, and this is open to the public. We have a mixer from 3 to 7. Old grads are coming back and so forth, and 7's the banquet.
So you don't have to be a graduate.
No.
All right.
Anybody is welcome.
Get tickets ahead of time.
And you get your tickets ahead of time at all the banks here in Kennett.
All right, and I think we talked about the museum showings already being in the works and on display right now, photos, trophies, lots of things. Drop by the museum. And Coach Cherry, good to have you talk with us about I have a feeling we could have done 3 shows this afternoon with your stories, and we may back up to that.